This is Microeconomics lecture number 12 on imperfect markets. Let's learn some economics. If you'll recall from the previous lecture, and in fact most of the lectures that have come before, have dealt with perfectly competitive markets. With imperfectly competitive markets, we're going to see a range of differences. Most of what we said concerning a perfectly competitive market is going to apply to your imperfectly competitive market, with a few minor alterations that we'll go over. And if you can remember that continuum from the preceding lecture, you had, on the one side, you had perfect competition, and on the other side, sometimes referred to as pure competition, and on the other side you had monopoly. Okay, and what differentiates them along this scale is the degree of market power, which is control of prices, the number of entry barriers, the differentiation of products, and the number of firms. Okay, and it's a continuum that goes along. So when we move from perfect competition to monopolistic competition, we'll have fewer firms that produce it. We'll have a slightly higher degree of entry barriers. We'll have a considerable larger degree of product differentiation, and we'll have some greater control over market prices. Okay, and so this continuum will move on until we get to monopoly. With monopolistic competition, the defining feature of monopolistic competition, how you know whether or not something's monopolistically competitive, is do they make any attempt whatsoever to differentiate their product from others. Product differentiation is everything in monopolistic competition. And so anything that you see advertised is monopolistic competition, because what do they do with their advertising? They try to differentiate their product from other products on any number of dimensions. Take, for example, the automobile industry. One of the things that bothers me about the book is the book refers to automobiles as though they're oligopolistic. Well, there was a time when that was the case, back in the 1950s and 60s, when you had three major automobile producers in the United States, okay, Ford, Chrysler, and GM, then yeah, you had basically oligopolistic control of the market. That's not the case anymore. If we looked at the industry concentration, and one of the things we'll learn before the end of this lecture, as we get to the end of this lecture, is we're going to look at the different measurements that they do, how they measure industry concentration to determine whether or not something's perfectly competitive, monopolistically competitive, or oligopolistic. Okay, we'll take a look at that on the four-firm ratio and the Herfindahl index. The Herfindahl index is the one I like better, but that's beside the point right now. But in monopolistic competition, they differentiate their products. Okay, so for example, fast food restaurants will differentiate the price. Oh, to get back to what I was talking about with automobiles, the book refers to this as oligopoly, and now with all of the international competition, that's not really the case. You don't only have the three major U.S. auto producers, you also have all the Japanese, and you have all the Europeans, and you have the South Koreans, etc. Okay, and what they'll differentiate their product on is things like gas mileage, safety features, comfortability of ride. Okay, we see all kinds of things. Anything, alcoholic beer, right? The beer ads, same thing, right? You have Budweiser and all those. And, it's the same basic idea. If you see them attempting to differentiate their product from others, then it's monopolistically competitive. If we bounce this off our perfectly competitive firm, you don't see farmers or fishermen or miners going in and trying to differentiate their lump of coal from other miners. Okay, they're effectively all the same product. That's one of the defining features of perfect competition. To the degree that you can differentiate that, you're moving into monopolistic competition. Now, that's not the case with monopoly, or with monopoly or oligopoly. Oligopolies are very clearly defined as a few firms controlling the entire industry. Okay, and we'll look at what this means, and we'll look at the measurement systems of this, as I said before. But with oligopolies, you don't necessarily have product differentiation. Probably the most famous oligopoly in the world today is OPEC. Okay, well, in OPEC, you don't really differentiate their products. One barrel of oil is the same as another. What differentiates them from perfectly competitive firms is they have considerably more market power, because there are very few firms that control the industry. That gives them more market power and more control over prices. And what we'll see is that in imperfect competition, how they're going to control the price is largely by adjusting supply output. Okay, that's going to be true with imperfect competition. Of course, our perfectly competitive, just to reiterate, our perfectly competitive firm doesn't have control over prices. They take whatever the industry price is. And then with monopoly, of course, you have one firm that produces the entire market. And so in this case, with a monopoly, if we think of it in the abstract, their product differentiation is absolute because a monopoly has a unique product. Okay, and one of the examples that I'll use is pharmaceutical companies. We'll deal with this when we get to natural monopolies as well. A pharmaceutical company, when it first develops a new drug, is given a patent on that drug. That patent creates an entry barrier. Nobody else can produce it, and therefore they have a unique product, which means that they have absolute monopolistic control of the production of that drug. Okay, and typically what happens is that patent is granted for 5 years, and then after the 5-year time, it gets opened to competition. And what happens is once it's open to competition, it really moves very quickly towards a perfectly competitive market. So you have generic drugs that are sold. Okay. Now, again, just kind of to reiterate what we said here. In monopolistic competition, you have a high degree of product differentiation, which is why they advertise, which means non-price competition. That's what the book refers to as non-price competition. You have limited entry barriers, but still some, and there you have examples there at the bottom. In oligopoly, you have a few firms that provide the entire production. Typically, the way that the Herfindahl index works, and we'll get to that in a minute, we'll get to that eventually, is if 3 firms or fewer control greater than 60% of the market share, they consider that oligopolistic. With the 4-firm ratio of concentration, if 4 firms control greater than 40%, they tend to think of it as an oligopoly. And we'll deal with that eventually. We'll deal with, and then how government involves itself and regulates this, kind of as a foreshadowing of our eventual lecture on government intervention in microeconomics. And then, of course, now, with monopoly, we want to differentiate a little bit the different types of monopolies that exist. First, we have the vertical monopoly. The vertical monopoly is simple to understand. A vertical monopoly does not necessarily have 100% market share of the finished product. Okay? Vertical monopolies are a little more common. A vertical monopoly controls all of the inputs into the production of a final product and produces the final product. So, for example, at the turn of the 20th century, Andrew Carnegie and Carnegie Steel was a vertical monopoly. Why? Because Andrew Carnegie controlled iron and coal mines. He controlled railroads that brought the iron and coal to his steel factories, and then he controlled the steel mills. Okay, so if you control the inputs, the production of the inputs as well, and the production of a final product, that's a vertical monopoly. Horizontal monopolies are the ones that are more commonly thought of as monopolies. A horizontal monopoly is where they control 100% of the market share for the finished product. And we'll deal with those a little more exclusively. Horizontal monopolies are not as common now as they used to be. And that's because of the decline in natural monopolies, which we'll get to next. With natural monopolies, we want to be as clear as possible. A natural monopoly exists any time that the industry-wide average total cost precludes subjecting it to competition. Okay? In other words, what we're going to see, and we saw it in perfect competition, we've seen it throughout this half-semester. What competition does is exert pressure on the market and in the industry for price reductions. Okay? As firms enter into the production of something, it pushes the supply curve outward to the right and drops prices. Well, if the price drops below the average total cost, then you're losing money. Okay? So in an industry where the average total cost is so high that any kind of competition is going to force the price below average total cost, you have a natural monopoly. Okay? Railroads, the original airlines, and what I mentioned, pharmaceuticals. Okay? The thinking behind this is that the original development of a drug is very cost intensive. Research and development, paying all the lab rats, paying all the tests, paying paying off the FDA to get a. That's not true. They don't pay off the FDA. The FDA is an extraordinarily uncorruptible organization. But all of the different things create an enormous average total cost for the production of the first units of that drug. Because of that, we can't have multiple corporations trying to develop and design the same drug and competing in the production of that drug, because the competition will drive the price down and it will drop below the average total cost, and nobody will want to do it because they'll incur losses, and so you won't have any new drugs developed. Okay, and in the United States, the development of drugs and pharmaceuticals is everything. We live in a kind of a druggy society, and I don't mean illegal drugs. I mean pharmaceutical drugs. Everybody I know is on a pharmaceutical drug of some kind: blood pressure, cholesterol, all of the various antidepressants and anti-anxietants, and all of these different things. Okay, so in the development of this, the original development of a new drug is extremely cost intensive. Okay, and so they're granted a patent, typically for 5 years, that grants them a monopoly in the control of it, and so the drugs are extremely expensive for the first 5 years. After that patent runs out, okay, they're not allowed to apply for the patent again. It gets open to competition, and once it's open to competition, it moves very rapidly towards almost perfect competition. Okay, the only thing preventing it really gets to monopolistic competition, but moves towards perfect competition because there's not really very much. Like, for example, when Seroquel, which is an antidepressant, came out, okay, when Seroquel came out, the pharmaceutical company that developed it maintained a monopolistic control, and literally it cost approximately $10 per pill. Okay, well, that let go about a year and a half ago. 2 years ago, they lost their patent on that. And so as a result of that, the price of a pill has dropped actually below $2 now. And so it's very cheap if you buy the generic type. All right. And so the prices drop because of the competition, and so it opens itself up to competition more. The other thing that's going to threaten a natural monopoly is technological improvement. Okay, so for example, in the beginning days of utilities such as the telephone, okay, when AT&T Ma Bell first develops the telephone, okay, it faces an extraordinarily high average total cost. Why? Because of the development of all the infrastructure. Okay, they have to lay all the phone lines, they have to build all the phone poles, they have to do everything. That creates an enormous average total cost. If you subject that to competition, it's going to drive the price down below the average total cost. They're going to operate at a loss. They're going to fail. They're not going to want to operate. And so nobody's going to have a telephone. The same thing was true of electricity, natural gas provision, water provision. Water provision is the last of them to really go. But like, for example, in the state of Pennsylvania, only recently, last 5 years, they've subjected electricity production to competition. In fact, I just changed this last year my electric provider. Okay, and it took a while because Duquesne Light, who was the original monopolistic, it was a natural monopoly that was granted to Duquesne Light in western Pennsylvania, because they faced the infrastructure development costs. They had to lay all the electric wires, they had to lay all the electric lines, okay, they had to service all the lines, etc. And so they faced an enormous infrastructure development cost, which raised their average total cost to the point where you couldn't subject it to competition because it would drive price below average total cost. Okay, with me so far? Well, technological improvements have made it so that you can produce electricity very cheaply. Okay, it's not nearly as expensive as it used to be. And so as a result of this, the price reduction won't drive it below the average total cost. Duquesne Light tied it up for years, and they said, well, that's a little unfair because we had to eat the upfront costs of developing all the infrastructure, of putting up all the lines, etc. So to now allow other electric providers to provide electricity and use our infrastructure is a little unfair. You have to give us a piece of the action. And that's how it works for the most part now. Duquesne Light itself doesn't provide electricity. They don't produce it. They now own all the lines. Okay, they own all the infrastructure. They do the services. You still pay your electric bill to Duquesne Light. Duquesne Light gets a cut of the action from whomever the electric provider is. Okay, for the use of they basically rent Duquesne Light's infrastructure. That's the course of natural monopolies. Same thing is happening with cable television. They're being subjected to competition now, etc. Okay, and we'll take a harder look at that a little later. Now, here's one of the more subtle economic points to get at, and we need to think it through, okay, so that we master the idea. What we dealt with in perfectly competitive markets was that marginal revenue equals price. Marginal revenue was the change in total revenue, okay, divided by a 1 unit increase in sales, 1 unit increase in demand, if you'll recall that. All right. Well, that was for a perfectly competitive market. That's the same as the price, which means that for a perfectly competitive market, the price and demand are the same thing. Marginal revenue equals demand in a perfectly competitive market. That's what we've been dealing with all along. Okay. And this is because in a perfectly competitive market, the individual firm has zero market power. They cannot control prices. They can do nothing to change the prices. They have to take whatever the industry standard is for pricing. And so the individual firm faces the industry demand curve, which is why in the market period, they face a completely elastic demand curve, which we'll talk about in just a second. Okay, well, in an imperfectly competitive market, that's not the case. In an imperfectly competitive market, marginal revenue and price are not the same thing. And we'll go through the rationale in a minute as to why that's the case. In point of fact, the marginal revenue curve, the marginal revenue line in an imperfectly competitive market is going to be less than demand. It's going to be less than the price. Okay. In point of fact, what we're going to find out is that it's going to be exactly 1/2, and we'll see why that's the case. Now let's take a look at this, okay, and let's look at the rationale behind this. And the book gives another example of this, okay, in their discussion of imperfect markets and why this is the case. This is a different example that I came up with so that you can have two different examples so that you can put this through your brain. And believe me, I understand the subtlety of this concept, that it's difficult, but we want to simplify it as much as possible. Okay, now let's take a firm that sells 1 unit for $20. Okay, now they're in an imperfect market, they're monopolistically competitive, etc. Okay, in order for them to be able to sell another unit, the only way they can do that is to drop the price. Now, the problem is that they can't just drop the price of that additional unit. For them to sell 2 units, they have to drop the price of both units. Okay? That's what we've been dealing with all along. We've been dealing with price and quantity at equilibrium. Okay? This is the source of consumer surplus, by the way. In an ideal world, and what we look at in more advanced microeconomics classes, what we look at in intermediate price theory and at economic foundations for decision making is how you can actually do that. Okay? It's what's referred to as first degree price discrimination. Okay, when you can charge each individual customer exactly what they're willing to pay for the thing. Okay, here we're not going to discuss that. Here we're not there. Not everyone can do that. Okay, so in an imperfectly competitive market, if we want to sell 1 unit, we can sell it for $20. But if we want to sell 2 units, we have to sell them for $18, which means we have to sell both of them for $18. So now we look over here, okay? If we want to sell 1 unit, we charge $20. and we get $20 of revenue, which is $20 of marginal revenue. But if we want to sell 2 units, we have to drop the price of both units, $18. That means our revenue is only going to be $36. Okay, 2 times 18, which means our marginal revenue from the additional unit is actually only $16, which is less than the price of the units. Okay, follow it through again. If we want to sell a 3rd unit of the product, we have to drop the price of the product to $16. That price drop has to be for all 3 units, which means now our revenue is going to be $48. Okay, for a marginal revenue of $12. You see that it goes down. You see what it is? It's 1/2. It starts out here, then it's $2 less, $4 less, $6 less, $8 less, $10 less, $12 less, $14 less, $16 less, $18 less. Marginal revenue less than price. Okay? That goes up. That's why the marginal revenue curve is less than the price, and the marginal revenue curve, as it works out, is 1/2 of the price. Okay? And I'm afraid that if I keep going over this over and over and over, it's simply going to confuse you. It's a very basic idea. What you have to remember is that if you wish to sell more than 1 unit, the only way you can do that is by dropping the price for all of the units. Okay? If we ultimately want to sell 10 units, we can do that. But we can only charge $2 for each of those units. I mean, ideally, we could charge 20 for this unit and 18 for this unit, okay, and get $38 in revenue. And then $16 for this unit, but we can't do that. That's where you engage in first-degree price discrimination, where you can charge every single customer something different. And where the essence of this is just kind of as an aside now, not to confuse you, but just kind of as an aside, where you see this kind of thing is anytime you see haggling. That's what haggling is all about. Haggling is a very clear form of first-degree price discrimination, where you can sit there and discuss how much you're willing to pay. We see this in the automobile industry. Okay, that's why automobile salesmen are really unique individuals. They have to be really good salesmen, because they have to be able to judge when a customer walks through the door, how much is that guy willing to pay for this automobile? Will they actually pay the sticker price that's on there? If so, that's what I'm going to charge them. Okay? Nah, not usually they don't. Okay, you got to cut that down a little bit. How much? I have to be able to measure them out. Where you see this also is at a little place, I've mentioned it before, because it's just a wonderful example of kind of perfectly competitive environments, although really it's monopolistic competition. This little place down here, Rogers, Ohio. Okay, it's a brilliant place, because that's how I deal with it. Okay, that's how I work, and the guys are willing to work with you. You go up, and they might list something for $10. But you can sit there and say, you know what, that I'm not giving you $10 for that. I'll give you $8. Okay? That's how we can start to measure this. That's how marginal revenue will start to come closer to the price. My best deal at Rogers, I got a hedge trimmer, a weed whacker, right? That has double spool. Okay, a double spool. Those things are like $200 new. I got the thing for $20. And the guy screwed up. The guy, he originally listed it for 50, and I talked him down to 20, and he screwed up because he thought we were negotiating over a single spool one. So I got a double spool weed whacker for $20, and the thing was basically brand new. It was brilliant. Okay, that's economics. All right. Okay, so now that's how it's going to work, and we'll go over it again. And we'll simplify it each time so that we understand this, because I grant you, it's a difficult idea. It doesn't at first make sense that we would have to do this. What keeps it clear is to understand that if you want to sell more units, you have to drop the price. You can't just drop the price of an additional unit. You have to drop the price of all of the units, including the preceding units. Okay? Now, the demand and MR curves. What I mentioned, let's go back, all the way back. Let's go back all the way. Where do we learn this? Back in lecture number 3. All the way back to lecture 3, and we've used it since then, where we had our demand function. P equals A minus BQ, where this was the price of the product, this is the y-intercept, this is the slope, and then this is the quantity. We should by now you should know that in your sleep in this class, okay? From the table that we just looked at, okay, that demand curve is 22 minus 2Q, simply enough. Well, if you look at the marginal revenue from that curve, we end up with this. 22 equals 20, marginal revenue equals 22 minus 4Q. And so you see it's 1/2, it's double the slope, okay, of the demand curve. And go ahead and look at that table again. Hopefully what you're doing is you're printing out these PowerPoints before you listen to the lecture. Look at that table again and see those two different functions. They're both linear functions, and what you'll see is that marginal revenue is 1/2 of the price. Graphically, what that looks like is this. Here we have our demand curve, right? And this is all drawn from that table from a couple of slides ago. 22 minus 2Q. You see that marginal revenue is 1/2 of that. Okay, 22 minus 4Q. Now, let's look at the relationship of marginal revenue and total revenue. All right? We've looked at the relationship of marginal and total before. If marginal is positive, okay, as long as marginal, here's our 0 point right here. Okay, if marginal is positive, total revenue goes up. And in fact, when we bring calculus into this, and don't worry, I don't want to frighten you, we're not bringing calculus into this, but when we bring calculus into this, the slope of the total revenue curve as it goes up is the marginal revenue curve. Okay, it's the derivative. Now, all right, and that's enough said on that. And so what we see is as marginal revenue, and what we notice from the table is that marginal revenue is less each time. It's downward sloping like the demand curve. In fact, it's 1/2 of the demand curve. Well, as long as it's greater than 0, the total revenue curve goes up. When it hits the 0 point, total revenue maxes out. So your maximum total revenue is going to be where the marginal revenue curve equals 0. Once marginal revenue becomes negative, as it did in that table, total revenue is going to start to drop off. Now we can either look graphically at that, or we can figure it out mathematically, algebraically. Okay, we just figured out that this was our marginal revenue curve. Okay, that's this curve right here, 22 minus 4Q. Well, it's very simple then to figure out where marginal revenue is. Instead of P, let's think of it as marginal revenue. Okay, well, that means we set it equal to 0, 22 minus 4Q. Well, the Q would be 5.5 at that point. It would be right about here. That the total revenue curve, that marginal revenue would equal 0, and you'd max out. Okay, here in the graph, we have 5 and 6. We don't have 5.5 delineated. And so that's how you're going to max out how you'll determine your maximum point of total revenue. Your maximum point of total revenue is where marginal revenue equals 0. Now, let's start to look at imperfect markets and what they look like. And let's tie together the things that we've talked about. And this graph is derived from the graph. It's very similar to the graph. I want you to be able to look at more than one thing. This is very similar to the graph from page 282. All right. Now we start with this basic idea that we've just been going over. For the perfectly competitive firm, demand and marginal revenue are the same thing. So to maximize profit, our perfectly competitive firm looks for marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Well, for the perfectly competitive firm, marginal revenue and demand are the same curve. So you're effectively looking for where demand equals marginal cost, right here. This is not the case for the imperfectly competitive firm in an imperfect market. They will operate under exactly the same profit maximization rule. When we dealt with profit maximization over and over and over and over and over, what we dealt with was money in greater than or equal to money out. Ultimately, our point of profit maximization is where money in equals money out, beyond the point of capital saturation. We went over this and over this and over this. We had an extra credit problem on it. Okay, this is how important this idea is. Well, that's why I wanted to make sure that we mastered this idea before we moved on to imperfect markets, because we're not going to change that. It's the same for an imperfect market. The imperfect competitor, the monopolistically competitive firm, the monopoly, faces the same profit maximization consideration. Marginal revenue equals marginal cost. The difference is that for the imperfectly competitive firm, marginal revenue and demand are not the same thing. Marginal revenue will be 1/2 of demand, which means here we have our demand curve. Well, we look at our marginal revenue curve. Our marginal revenue curve is 1/2 of that. Now, I might parenthetically ask you at this point, based on what we've just talked about, here is where marginal revenue equals 0. That means that this quantity of production is where total revenue is going to max out. You'll notice that where total revenue maxes out, that is not the same point where profit maxes out. Okay? Keep that in mind. And so we're going to face exactly the same consideration as we did with a perfectly competitive firm. What we're concerned with is where money in equals money out. Here is money in, here is money out. Marginal revenue, marginal cost, where we see that that's right here. This is where marginal revenue equals marginal cost at this level of production. Note, and I'll just, well, you know what, we'll do this in the next graph if I remember correctly. We'll do this in the next graph, but you'll note this is not the same production level for a perfectly competitive firm. A perfectly competitive firm facing the same problem, marginal revenue equals marginal cost, but for the perfectly competitive firm, demand and marginal revenue are the same curve, so they'll produce up here for this level of quantity. All right? Now, we want to start looking at this graphically and mastering this graph. What does average total cost tell us? Average total cost tells us at each level of production, what is the average total cost? So this over here is price and cost. Okay? Price and cost. Well, okay, as we produce more, average total cost drops. We learned this in, I think, lectures 7 and 8, okay, on production functions and profit maximization. Till it reaches a minimum point, then it starts to go back up. Now, what we're thinking about now, we haven't really thought about it before. It's been in the background, okay? It's been an inference, but we haven't specifically talked about it, is profit per unit. Okay? Well, profit per unit is fairly intuitive, is it not? What we've dealt with is overall profit. Overall profit is total revenue minus total cost. Well, we can also think about that as profit per unit, which is average revenue minus average cost. Average total revenue minus average total cost. Okay? We think of it as money in per unit minus money out per unit. That will give us our profit per unit. Okay? Well, average total cost is money out per unit. A little bit different than marginal cost, right? That's average total cost. Average total cost is money out per unit. The price will be money in per unit. And so what's going to happen is the profit maximizing level of production, where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, this point right here, we then run up to the demand curve to see for that level of production, what will the price be? Okay, if we set demand equal to this, what price will consumers be willing to pay? Okay, they'll be willing to pay this price right here. That means that our profit is going to be the distance between, at that level of production, the distance between the average total cost and the price, which is to say, the average money out per unit and the average money in per unit. That's going to be our profit per unit, okay, is going to be this distance. To get total profit, we would then multiply this by the total number of units we've sold. Okay, simple enough. We'll go over this again. Now, as I just said, the decision regarding, I wanted you to have something hard copy to look at while we go over this. The decision regarding profit maximizing production is the same for the producer in an imperfect market as it is for the producer in a perfectly competitive market. Marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Note the difference. In an imperfect market, because marginal revenue is not equal to demand, the amount of profit, which is the distance between the ATC and the price at the profit maximizing level of production, is greater. Okay? All right, now let's add this in, okay, and take a look at this. Again, what I keep reiterating, both our imperfectly competitive firm and our perfectly competitive firm face the same profit maximizing decision. Marginal revenue equals marginal cost. The difference is that for our perfectly competitive firm, demand and marginal revenue are the same thing. So they'll look where marginal cost equals demand, okay, which is marginal cost equals marginal revenue for the perfectly competitive firm. For our imperfectly competitive firm, they're going to set marginal revenue equals marginal cost for their profit maximizing level of production as well. The difference is that for them, the marginal revenue is 1/2 of demand. It's less than demand. So for them, marginal revenue equals marginal cost right here. They then go up and set that equal to the demand curve right here. Okay? Now, for our perfectly competitive firm, it's a little bit different. Okay? They'll set where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, but for them, marginal revenue is the demand curve. So their profit maximizing level of production is right here. Okay? Note that that means it's a lower price. That also means it's less profit. Okay? The key is to look at the average total cost curve. For our imperfectly competitive firm, the profit is going to be the distance between the average total cost curve and the price. That's your average profit per unit. You then multiply that by the number of units for your overall profit. For our perfectly competitive firm, they're going to do the same thing. Here's the average total cost curve at that level of production. So you want to pay attention to where the average total cost curve is at every level of production. Okay? Well, their profit will be the same. We're talking about average profit per unit. Okay? Here's the price. Here's the average total cost. This is money in on average. This is the average money in per unit. This is the average money out per unit. The difference is this profit level. Okay? That's your profit. You multiply that by the number of units produced, and you have overall profit. Okay? We want to pay attention to this. Look at this again, okay, and replay the part of the lecture on it if you need to. But think about this again. All right? Now, again, just I want to go over this over and over and over until we've got it locked in our brains. All right? For the firm functioning under conditions of perfect competition, because marginal revenue equals demand, their profit maximizing level of production, MR equals MC, is the same as where marginal cost equals the demand curve. Okay? Note what this does. This is what's creating the downward pressure on price. That's why the price for the perfectly competitive firm is less than the price for the imperfectly competitive firm. Now, you note that blue line that was there in the previous slide. Okay? That's unused capacity. You noted that our imperfectly competitive firm's optimal production level, meaning profit maximizing production level, was less than our perfectly competitive level, our perfectly competitive firms. That is how they're going to exert market power. Okay? That's how an imperfectly competitive firm exerts market power. They limit production. This is, in fact, how OPEC controls the price of oil. They control the price of oil by issuing all of the members a production quota and limiting the production of oil. Okay? That's what controls prices. That's how an imperfectly competitive market works. Okay? Our perfectly competitive firm can't do that. Okay, they have to take whatever the market dictates. Now, let's look at the case of natural monopoly. What we said with a natural monopoly exists when the cost of production, which is to say the average total cost, is higher than the price. Okay? We go once again, and this is why this profit maximizing stuff was so critically important and why we really wanted to lock it down. Marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Okay? Well, that's going to be our profit maximizing level of output. If the price at that level is less than, okay, the average total cost, then we're going to operate at a loss. All right? And we saw that in profit maximizing. We saw that based on the supply schedules that we developed, okay? If the price is too low, you're actually operating below the average total cost curve, which means you're operating at a loss. Okay? Well, now let's take a look at this. Let's look first at our imperfectly competitive industry, our imperfectly competitive firm. Again, their marginal revenue is not the same as the demand curve. It's 1/2 of the demand curve, which means they set, and these are a little bit off. As I translated into the PowerPoint, they fell a little bit off, so we'll just leave them where they are. But the marginal cost equals marginal revenue right here. That leads to a price along the demand curve right here. And you note, here's our average total cost curve. Again, the interpretation of this, what this means. For this many units of production, this is the average total cost. As we increase production, go along the horizontal axis and increase production, the average total cost goes up. All right? So at this level of production, this is our average total cost. This is the price along the demand curve where the marginal revenue equals the marginal cost curve. We just simply go up to it. It's very simple. We find this first, where this point is, and then we go straight up to the demand curve. Even with the little bit of a skewed, as I translated this onto a PowerPoint from the Excel graphic, it got a little skewed, but you can see if we run right up here, it'll still be above the average total cost curve. However, if we take this industry and reduce the entry barriers and allow competition to develop and allow it to move towards perfect competition, what's going to happen, once we enter into perfect competition, the demand curve and the marginal revenue curve are the same, which means that where the profit maximizing level of production will be, okay, is right here. That's where marginal revenue, which for the perfectly competitive firm is the same as demand, equals the marginal cost. You'll notice that that is under the average total cost curve for that production level. All right? We would like to be able to reduce production so that we can still make a profit. The problem is we can't do that. We can't do that because we're in a perfectly competitive industry. If we don't produce it, one of our competitors will. And so industry-wide, it's going to drop it down to this price. That's going to be the profit maximizing level of production. Okay, so our best we can do with profit maximization is to operate at a loss. And if we operate at a loss, we'll fail, and so we won't produce, and so we'll shut down. All right? That's the basic idea behind this. This is what a natural monopoly looks like. All right? If we could lower the average total cost below this point, then it wouldn't be a natural monopoly anymore. When we're talking about natural monopolies, one of the things I mentioned to you is the idea that, well, there are certain things that can lower that average total cost. Technological improvements will lower the average total cost. Okay? If we have a technological improvement that increases the productive capacity of the firm, okay, we invent a new machine that reduces the average total cost, that can drop this curve down to the point where we can open it up to competition. All right? Now, this is to amplify what we've talked about before in natural monopolies, and this is pretty much what I just said. I just want you to have hard copy to read it, and it's in the book as well. It's in the book as well, but it's difficult to really clearly explain this because it's a fairly subtle idea in economics, but it's critical that we understand it. A natural monopoly exists where the point at which marginal cost equals marginal revenue is less than the average total cost curve. We just looked at that. Under conditions of perfect competition, the marginal revenue equals demand. Now, from the illustration that we just looked at, note that the marginal cost equals demand is less than the average total cost curve, which means the firm incurs a loss at the profit maximizing level of output. To prevent this, a monopoly is allowed to develop. Okay, since in imperfect competition, marginal revenue is not equal to demand. The point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost creates a profit maximizing output level and price that is still above the average total cost. Natural monopolies exist where the average total cost is so high that the price reducing pressure of competition would force firms to operate at losses and shut down. Another example of where natural monopolies existed, okay, prior to the late 70s, the airline industry. The government gave airline industries protected air routes because competition would have reduced the price below the average total cost. This is one of the defining features of the airline industry, is that you have a very high production cost because airplanes are expensive. Okay, a 727 is $85 million. Okay, so not everybody can get into the airline industry. Not everybody can foot the bill on that. All right, that means that you have protected markets. If you were to subject them to competition, okay, the price would drop. Demand would come closer to the marginal revenue curve. The price would drop below average total cost. This, in fact, is exactly what happened to the airline industry beginning in the late 70s. The Carter administration began the deregulation of the airline industry. The Reagan administration accelerated it. I just talked about this in my U.S. history class in the 1980s. Okay? So that by the mid-90s, the airline industries, the older ones, not Southwest, but airline industries like U.S. Airways, which was the old Allegheny Airlines, United, way back when, the first to fail was TWA, Pan Am. They were all beginning to operate because of the competition, because they opened up competition in all the air routes. Prices had to get slashed, and I can remember very vividly the price wars between airlines. Okay, so the prices got slashed. Well, the problem is that pulled the industry-wide price below the average total cost, which meant they were operating at a loss. They were able to sustain this for a period of time by borrowing money and leveraging their fleets. They would borrow money against their air fleets to be able to look at least as though they were still making money, when in fact they were operating at a loss. And so that after 9/11/2001, when demand for air travel collapsed, because people became terrified of being used as missiles to bomb buildings, which I guess I can understand. But when that collapsed, the demand curve dropped price even lower, and it was no longer possible for them to sustain the losses that they'd been sustaining for so long. And all of a sudden, because demand had dropped so much, they could no longer finance their loans, and a number of them, United and U.S. Airways, for example, proclaimed bankruptcy. Okay? And so natural monopolies are actually quite interesting animals. They're quite interesting animals. I despise monopolies because monopolies, and we'll deal with this in just a second, because monopolies don't approach economic efficiency. However, there are reasons for them. We looked in the last lecture at the idea of economic efficiency and why perfect competition creates economic efficiency. Okay, well, what the implication of that is that imperfect competition cannot create economic efficiency, either allocative efficiency or productive efficiency, meaning that when we have an imperfectly competitive market, such as a monopoly, there's no drive, because of the entry barriers, because of what we've been talking about for the last 10 minutes. There's no drive. There's no downward pressure on prices. And because there's no downward pressure on prices, there's no downward pressure on profits. That's what creates the downward pressure on profit. And because there's no downward pressure on profit, you may never reach the point where price equals the minimum marginal cost, which means you'll never meet the point where price equals minimum average total cost, which means you won't produce efficiently. Okay? Now, the final word on natural monopolies, as we've been saying. Typically, natural monopolies exist where fixed costs are considerably high, such as railroads, when they were first created in the 19th century, airlines, utilities, the development of new drugs by pharmaceutical companies. Natural monopolies cease to exist if the average total cost, particularly fixed costs, are reduced. In the case of utilities, for example, technological improvements reduce the ATC by making it possible to produce for less, reducing the advantages of a monopoly. Okay? All right. Now let's look at our industry concentration measurements. Okay, so that we can determine what type of industry we're looking at. And largely they're arbitrary. They're generally just rules of thumb. The Security and Exchange Commission, which is a government agency at the federal level, monitors this. They're the ones who monitor industry concentration. Okay? And under the Security and Exchange Act, there are certain concentrations which are to be avoided. Oligopolistic and monopolistic business practices are illegal under the Security and Exchange Act. Okay, so we monitor different industries to see what their concentration is. Now, the first of these measurements is the four-firm concentration ratio. You look at the output of the four largest producers, okay, and determine what the percentage that is of the total output of the firm. And so you have the output of the four largest producers divided by or relative to the total production of the industry. If total industry output is 100 units, for example, and the four largest producers produce 50 units, the four-firm industry concentration ratio is 50. Anything greater than 40 raises a red flag. That moves you in the direction of oligopoly. Okay? The one I like better is the Herfindahl index, because it seems a little bit more subtle, and that's why I kind of like it more. This is simply the sum of squares of the market shares of all of the firms in an industry. Okay, so that the highest possible Herfindahl index measurement is 10,000. Now let's look at how this is derived. If you have a monopoly, one firm controlling 100% of the market, okay, that would be 100 squared for 10,000. Let's suppose we have two firms, each of whom control 50% of the market. Okay, you would have 50 squared plus 50 squared equals 5,000. Okay, now let's take another look at the same basic type of idea. What if you had two firms controlling the entire market? It's a duopoly. The two firms produce 100% of the market share. But in this case, one of the firms produces 80%. The other firm produces 20%. Well, in that case, you have a much higher industry concentration, don't you? When the two firms evenly split the market, we had an industry concentration of 5,000. When one of the firm is clearly dominant with 80% and the other firm only produces 20%, you have 6,800. That's much more concentrated. That's the main reason I like this measurement better than the four-firm ratio. What if we were to do this with the four-firm ratio? Well, with the four-firm ratio, you only have two firms. And so the firms control 100%. And so both of these would arrive at the same four-firm ratio, 100. Okay? You see, there's a little bit more subtlety in the Herfindahl index. There's a little more differentiation in industry concentration. It gives us a little greater accuracy at the actual concentration of the industry. Okay? Now, as a rule of thumb with the Security and Exchange Commission, if a merger between two firms that produce the same product creates a Herfindahl index greater than 2,500, or if the merger changes the Herfindahl index by plus 200, if it raises the Herfindahl index by 200 points, that's a red flag. There's a possibility that they're going to block the merger. And one of the things we deal with in economic foundations uh, for decision making is, how can you make the argument with the Security Exchange Commission to allow the merger to take place? There has to be significant benefits to the economies of scale and the economies of cost and the economies of scope, etc. Okay, we don't deal with that here. All we worry about here is if the Herfindahl index, if we have a pre-merger Herfindahl index in a particular industry that's less than 2,500 and the merger brings it over 2,500, that's a red flag. Or if we have an industry with whatever Herfindahl index that increases the Herfindahl index by greater than 200, that's a red flag. Okay? Because it means that the industry is becoming too concentrated, and when it becomes too concentrated, it's going to create inflationary pressures and reduce the efficiency of the industry. Now, here we have a list, and this is from the book, the low concentration industries. Okay, we see these are the generally low, and we see the difference between the Herfindahl index and the four-firm concentration. These are low concentration industries. Okay, the four-firm concentration ratio in the smallest of them is bolts, nuts, and rivets, which is 4%. That means the four largest firms control 4% of the industry, which means it's not very concentrated at all. It's very competitive. And again, always remember with these things, it's a fairly arbitrary thing to say that, oh, well, one is perfectly competitive and the other is monopolistic competition. It's a continuum, okay? We're dealing with degrees here. And as we deal with the degrees, we're dealing with degrees of economic efficiency. Perfectly competitive firms are economically efficient. The more you move away from that perfect competition, the more you move away from economic efficiency, so that monopolies become the least efficient of them all. Okay. Now we have our high concentration industries. You see, the highest concentration industry is primary copper. Okay, this is the refining of copper, where you have four firms that control 99% of the industry. This is the stuff of which a cartel could be made. Okay, this is oligopolistic. Whereas you have down here motor vehicles, 68%. And that's why they say the four largest industries, which, one of which is Toyota, control 68%. I'm still not sure. I'm still not clear on why. Like, I wouldn't define it as oligopolistic, even with a higher than normal four-firm concentration. And that's because look at the difference here. Okay? What we said was, with the four-firm industry concentration, if it's over 40, they consider it oligopolistic. So automobiles would be oligopolistic. But if we look at the Herfindahl index, typically with the Herfindahl index, if it's over 2,500, it's considered oligopolistic. You have much greater subtlety here, and so automobiles in this case are not considered oligopolistic. See what I'm saying? But the difference between these two, this is why I like Herfindahl better. Now, the key difference is, just kind of to reiterate and go over once again, the profit max rule for the monopolist is the same as for the firm in a competitive industry. Marginal revenue equals marginal cost. However, for the competitive firm, marginal revenue equals price, which means it equals demand. For the monopolist, price is greater than marginal revenue. Okay? For the competitive industry, profit will cause new firms to enter, forcing down prices and evaporating profit so that price equals minimum marginal cost, which is what we said was a condition of allocative efficiency. In the long run, that will create price equals minimum average total cost, which is productive efficiency, meaning you're producing for the least. Allocative efficiency means that you are providing society as much as society wants at the price it's willing to pay. Now, for the monopolist, and for the monopolistically competitive, for anybody in imperfect competition, barriers to entry prohibit new firms from entering the industry, which precludes the price-reducing phenomenon of competition, and so potentially you can have perpetual profits. You can have perpetually a condition where price is greater than the minimum marginal cost, which means perpetually price is greater than the minimum average total cost, which precludes both allocative and productive efficiency, which is why imperfect industries are inefficient. Now, we want to go over just briefly the various barriers to entry that are provided or that are created that prevent new entries from coming into an industry. Natural monopolies is the first of them. Okay, one firm can create an economy of scale that produces the entire supply more efficiently than several smaller firms. That's what we've been saying all along. We've used many examples of this. What that means is that by reducing production levels, they can artificially inflate the price above average total cost. Okay, uh, you also have patent protection. This is the case of the pharmaceutical companies. Okay, when you have anybody, when they first file a patent, has monopolistic control of production of whatever it is they've got the patent on. Okay, well, patents run out. Okay, and the renewal of patents is largely determined by the SEC and the patent office. Okay, you also have litigation. Okay, which means legal action. Okay, if new entrants enter in, you can file suit against them, injunctions to try to prevent them from entering the industry on any number of grounds. This isn't a law class, and I'm not a lawyer, but among other things, patent violation, copyright violation, etc. Okay, another is to grant licensing. We can prevent new firms or limit the number of firms that enter an industry by granting producers a license to produce a particular product. Okay, and then finally, you can have government intervention. The government can simply grant monopolistic control. This is largely what we had happen with the granting of government franchises for utility companies, the airline, the monopolistic control of individual air routes by the airlines is an example of this. Okay, okay. Now let's look at a problem. Let's look at we like to finish off chapters and lectures with a problem. Let's take a look at this problem. Okay, here we have what we've been looking at all along. All right, we have our demand curve. We have the marginal revenue curve, which is roughly one half of that. Okay, so that total demand, and it's kind of just a rough sketch. It's total demand is 100 units. Marginal revenue will be 0 at 50, which means our maximum revenue will be actually at the production of 50 units. You'll note that once again, as I've iterated a few times, the point of maximum total revenue is not going to be the same as the profit maximizing level of output. Okay, now when we look at profit maximizing level of output, we have marginal cost equals marginal revenue. So our maximizing level of output right here is 30. We have marginal cost equals marginal revenue. So our maximizing level of production for our perfectly competitive firm is 40. Okay, so for our imperfectly competitive firm, our profit maximizing level of production is right here at 30. For our perfectly competitive firm, it's going to be higher at 40. All right, to determine the price, we simply take where marginal cost equals marginal revenue and determine what price we can charge given demand for that, okay, which will be $35. The perfectly competitive firm, it's a little bit easier calculation because their demand curve is their marginal revenue curve, and so their price will have to be $30. Okay, simple enough. And one question I might parenthetically add in this, and we'll take a look at it, is this graph right here. As we look at this, is this or is this not a case of a natural monopoly? Well, what did we say? A natural monopoly exists anytime that if you subject it to competition, the price-reducing pressures of competition will drop price below average total cost. Well, let's take a look at this. If we take this imperfectly competitive profit maximizing output level of 30 right here and subject it to competition, what happens? 10 more units are produced. The price will drop from $35, okay? From $35, that's where we are, down to $30, okay? Well, you note even at $30, the price is still above the average total cost curve. And so, no, this is not a case of natural monopoly. The perfectly competitive firm, by meeting market demand and by producing at the profit maximizing level of output, will in fact see money in per unit, which is the price, greater than money out per unit on average. Okay, so this is not a case of natural monopoly. Now, if the average total cost curve were higher, okay, above this point, then yes, it would be a case of natural monopoly, but this is clearly not. Now let's ask ourselves a few questions. What is the profit maximizing level of production in an imperfect market? What is the profit maximizing level of production in a perfectly competitive market? What is the profit for the imperfectly competitive firm? What is the profit for the perfectly competitive firm? We covered these first two already. We'll just go over them again, and then we'll look at the last two. All right, now let's take this problem off in stages. Let's first determine what the profit maximizing level of output is going to be. Let's look first for the imperfect firm, right? The imperfect competitor in the imperfect market, and then in the perfectly competitive market. Okay? Both of them face the same profit maximizing considerations in terms of determining the level of output. Marginal revenue equals marginal cost. The difference is that our imperfectly competitive firm, marginal revenue is not the same as demand. In fact, it's 1/2. So what we look for the imperfectly competitive market, the imperfectly competitive firm, is where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, which is down here. Okay? That's gonna give us their level of production, 30 units. Okay? For the perfectly competitive market, rather, demand and marginal revenue are the same thing. So we set marginal cost equals marginal revenue, which is the same thing as saying marginal cost equals demand, which means their profit maximizing level of production, where marginal cost equals marginal revenue equals demand, is 40 units. Okay? Okay, now let's deal with profit. Okay, first, let's look at the profit for the competitive firm. And I have the same graphic in the next two, so we can look at them both, actually. But let's break them down. Now, how do we calculate profit? Profit is revenue minus cost. Money in versus money out. Okay? We're dealing now, though, with averages. And we have to think to ourselves, first, let's look at costs. What does average total cost mean? Right? This is Marcus Aurelius. Take each thing in and of itself and say what it is. Average total cost is the cost of producing each unit on average. Well, what we're told here, what this average total cost curve shows us, is at all production levels, what the average cost of producing each unit is. We just determined that 30 units was the profit maximizing level of output for the imperfectly competitive firm, right? What is the average total cost of each of those 30 units? Right here, $25. Okay, so our total cost is simply going to be $25 per unit multiplied by the 30 units for a total of $750. Well, what about revenue? Well, what we determined was, okay, same basic thinking. We determined 30 units are to be produced to maximize profit, right? That's where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. We then went up and said, okay, we're going to produce 30 units. What price can we charge for 30 units? Well, for that, we go up to the demand curve again, all right? The demand is such that if we want to sell 30 units, we have to charge $35, right? So we'll sell 30 units at $35 a piece. Average money in is $35. For the 30 units, that means that our total revenue is going to be $1,050, which means we simply take total revenue minus total cost. That gives us our profit. 1,050 minus 750 is $300. Now we can do it differently, and maybe you've looked at this. If you look at this, you can see how you can do it. All right, wait a minute. The average cost of each unit is $25. That's average money out per unit. Well, the average money in per unit is the price, $35. Does it not then stand as a given? Does it not? Can we not conclude from that we're going to make $10 per unit in profit? We're going to bring $35 in per unit. It's going to cost us $25 to produce each unit. 35 minus 25 is 10. So we're going to make $10 in revenue, or $10 in profit per unit. We sell 30 units, we get $300 in profit. Gives us the same thing. It depends on whether or not you want to do it as total or an average. All right? Same exact thinking for the perfectly competitive firm. The only difference is that for our perfectly competitive firm, marginal revenue and demand are going to be the same thing. We determined based on that our profit maximizing level of output is 40. Okay, that's where marginal cost equals the demand curve, which equals the marginal revenue. Okay, for a perfectly competitive firm. And in order to sell 40 units, we have to charge $30 per unit. All right. Well, once again, our revenue is going to be $30 per unit for 40 units, $1,200. So we make more revenue than our monopolist. We make more revenue than our imperfectly competitive firm. Okay. But we make a lot less profit, ultimately. Why? Because, again, the average total cost curve shows at each production level how much does it cost to produce each unit. Well, when we were dealing with the imperfect competitor, they produced 30 units. The average total cost of 30 units was $25 a unit. But our perfectly competitive firm is going to produce 40 units. Well, the average total cost for 40 units is midway between these two, which is $27.50. Okay? And so now, to figure out total cost, right, $27.50, we produce 40 units at an average cost of $27.50 for a total cost of $1,100. We just determined that our revenue, okay, I kind of reversed these two, but we just determined our revenue is $1,200, which gives us a profit of $100. Or we can do exactly what we did last time. We can do it as average per unit. When we produce 40 units, the average cost per unit is $27.50. The average revenue per unit, which is the price, is going to be $30. That's going to be 30 minus $27.50. This means that we're going to make $2.50 per unit, does it not? Multiply that by the 40 units, you end up with $100 in profit. Now remember, again, I know what your mind is going to jump to, and I can understand it. It makes sense. It says, well, all right, wait a minute then. Since the imperfectly competitive firm makes more profit, principally because they produce fewer units, right? This is the unused capacity. And remember what I said before. How the imperfectly competitive firm, be it a monopolistically competitive firm or a monopoly, how they're going to control price, how they're going to exert their market power, is by limiting supply. Okay, they're going to limit productivity. They're going to reduce production. Okay, so all right, fine. I'll try to make more profit. I'll just reduce my production. If you are in a perfectly competitive environment, a perfectly competitive market, you can't do that. Okay? Because if you do that, if I, as a perfectly competitive firm, say, oh, all right, well, I'm looking at this, and if I produced only 30 units, I could charge $35. No, you couldn't. Because other producers, other competitors, there's no entry barriers. Somebody's going to fill that gap, and they're going to produce these extra units. That's going to drive the price down to $30. So that if I only produce 30, I'm only going to get $30 per unit, and I'm going to do even worse. Okay? All right. I think that explains it as clearly as possible. I've tried to go over it again and again and again, but there are just a few basic points that we need to keep in mind. The most important one is that in a perfectly competitive market, demand and marginal revenue are the same thing, which is to say that price equals marginal revenue. That's what we've been dealing with all along. For an imperfectly competitive market, that's not the case. Marginal revenue is less than demand. It's one half less in point of fact. So price is greater than marginal revenue. That's why we jump up to the price. This is still, the demand curve is still going to tell us the various combinations of prices and quantity. What the marginal cost and marginal revenue are going to tell us is how much do we produce. All right? And then we've simply, this is a different way of calculating profit. This is a graphic way of calculating it rather than algebraic way of calculating our profit. It's still the same basic idea. Money in versus money out. Revenue, money in, minus cost, money out. Okay, but now we're looking at it graphically. Now, a few notes. Note a couple of things. Measuring the distance from the ATC curve to the price given by the demand curves gives us a distance of $10. $35 minus $25. This is the average profit per unit. This is what we just talked about. We simply multiply this by the quantity for overall profit. $10 per unit for 30 units, $300. Doesn't matter whether we use totals or averages. Okay, now note this as well, that moving from the imperfectly competitive market to the competitive market has two effects. First, it exerts a downward pressure on prices from $35 to $30. Second, it produces a pressure to increase production, okay, and a production increasing effect from 30 to 40 units. Okay, the loss of production in terms of an imperfectly competitive market is usually referred to as a dead weight loss. And what it means, if we throw this all the way back to our original discussion of production possibility curves, it means that in imperfectly competitive markets, you're not producing along the production possibility curve. You're producing within it. You're not using all of your productive capacity. Why? Well, because my profit maximizing level of output is less than my total productive capacity because it's less than demand. Okay, and I think at long last that concludes this.